Now let's talk more about what we can expect from Intel after the bell. We're joined by Doug Freedman. He's an analyst with Broadpoint Amtech, and he's joining us from our San Francisco newsroom today. Doug, welcome. So you just heard Zara obviously talking about the gross margin situation, about the earnings situation. It really seems to all be coming down here to PC demand, and people are reading the tea leaves differently here in terms of how much it has picked up and how much it will continue to pick up. What's your perspective on that?
We're actually talking quite a bit about PC demand, but we're steering investors towards paying attention to what's happening on the IT side, where we're seeing server sales pick up quite nicely, and that's one of the most profitable segments, if not the most profitable segment for Intel. So we're very focused on how strong server sales are.
And Intel in this quarter is expected to break out its server business used in data centers and those used in business machines. What's your expectation for what we're going to hear from Intel on that?
Yeah, we're going to get a lot more clarity out of Intel this quarter. Earlier this week, they gave us the breakdown on how they're going to show us their revenue numbers. We're actually looking for north of 13 million units in servers in the total market this year, so 2010. We expect both ASPs and unit growth to exceed expectations in that market, and we think that that's going to drive those gross margins that everybody focuses on to new high levels.
And Doug, you mentioned something, you touched on it. Intel operating groups are going to include the PC client and the data center groups. How is that going to change the dynamic?
We think just investors are going to enjoy looking at more clarity on the numbers and being able to see how certain segments of Intel's business is actually growing. What we tend to look at with Intel, people say, hey, if I buy Intel, we have normalized earnings over the last several cycles of $1.20. Why should I think of Intel as a growth stock again? And I think as we get into the numbers, and you'll see that there are businesses inside of Intel that are actually growing, that actually should catch higher multiples than they presently do.
Doug, you mentioned the average selling price, ASPs, that have been improving and that you expect them to continue to improve. Looking at some of the notes from other analysts, though, they talked about the increasing popularity potentially of netbooks, which are a lower margin product, are they not?
Actually, that's sort of a misconception in the market. If we look at while it's a lower ASP product and a lower selling price, the margins on that business are actually likely to improve as Intel migrates those products to the advanced process node and lowers their cost. So those products are likely to start catching industry or company average margins in the very short term here.
Doug, I also want to ask you about the business that Intel is trying to increase, that is trying to diversify a little bit away from all of the IT and PCs and trying to get more into mobile chips as well. How successful do you think they've been thus far?
Yeah, so I mean, the netbook explosion is actually showing that by driving the cost down to their components, they've actually been able to drive some growth in that market. Now, people are worried about whether those lower powered machines cannibalize, but we still think that there's going to be a pretty good challenge, and it's going to take a while for the market to figure out whether consumers really want a smartphone that looks like a netbook, or whether we want a notebook that is just smaller and more portable. So that's really what we're going to be fighting with.
And Doug, as Zara Burton told us before you came on, the report today is key because it could give us a sense of the semiconductor sector going forward, and it could also give us a sense, if it won't, will this rally have legs? What do you think going forward?
Well, we happen to think that the rally does have legs, and that we'll see not just, we're going to probably have a pretty volatile year in semis in 2010. We've been out with our forecast where we think the semis peak sort of late in May. We probably have a little bit of a pullback this summer on concerns of an overbuild, but ultimately we think we end up finishing higher in December, as we think that the semiconductor cycle really continues to work its way through, looking for a 2 to 3 year cycle with the possibility of 1 or 2 quarters of less than seasonal growth, but that's nothing to worry about.
Doug, what do you think is going to help Intel close the gap with the rest of its competitors? I was looking at the semiconductor index today. It's up around 75% over the past year. Intel up about 10 percentage points less than that. Do you think that this report, for example, today is going to be enough of a catalyst to sort of close that gap between the two?
When you have a company as big as Intel, it's always going to probably have a little bit less beta than some of the peer groups that it competes against, that are in its index, just because they're smaller and more agile, and they also provide sometimes higher leverage to earnings growth. So it's sort of natural to find our sector leader to have a little bit less movement, both on the top and bottom end of the cycle.
Okay, Doug, we're out of time. Doug Freedman, analyst with Broadpoint Amtech. Those Intel earnings out after the bell.